In this video, you'll see how CrateDB's container data types, objects, and array make CrateDB a powerful database for storing and retrieving document data. We'll look at the different ways that an object schema can be specified in CrateDB, touch on how CrateDB indexes objects, and try out some example queries. JSON documents are everywhere. It's a common way of representing data, with many programming languages supporting the format. Sometimes these documents have a fixed schema, but it's not unusual for documents describing the same sort of data to differ in their representation of it. Here we have two JSON documents describing community areas in Chicago. The document on the right has additional notable resident and zip codes components. Notable resident is an object, zip codes is an array. Sometimes we want to create and enforce a strict schema for these documents, rejecting those that don't conform to it. For example, here we might want to reject the document for Norwood Park as it contains extra data we haven't planned for. In other cases, we want the flexibility to store and query such semi or unstructured documents in a single collection. How do we store and query these semi and unstructured data types in a relational type table? CrateDB has two container data types that enable us to model this sort of data in a flexible way. We'll begin by exploring the object type, then briefly touch on the second container type, the array. Let's explore the different ways in which we can model objects with CrateDB using our community areas dataset. Here I'm creating a table for community areas using the area number as an integer